The majority of current Hebrew Bible scholarship sees in the Exodus narrative a chronologically multi-layered text of cultural memory that anchors Israel's identity in a foundational event of its history of salvation. Being selected by its God Yahweh, Moses liberated the Hebrews from servitude in Egypt and brought the people as a full-fledged nation to the borders of the Promised Land. There is broad consensus in modern research that the literal historicity of the Exodus as given in the book of Exodus cannot be upheld. However, scholars often contrast the ahistoricity of the Exodus as described in the biblical text with the general historical plausibility of an Exodus event that could be seen as the nucleus of the biblical tradition. The transfer of groups of foreigners into and out of Egypt as prisoners, state-drafted workers, professionals, etc., is well attested throughout all of Egypt's history. However, tying any of this information directly to an Exodus event has so far proven elusive. The following remarks will look into extra-biblical information that may help to situate the Exodus event more precisely in time and space. The Egyptian names of Moses as preserved in versions of the infamous story of the lepers, and here I'm just following up on the previous talk. Please listen carefully. I will provide some sections of the text in a moment. This story, probably anti-Semitic in intention, reports how a king Amenophis was advised to cleanse Egypt of lepers and other polluted persons so he could realize his desire to see the gods. Amenophis confined 80,000 such people from Egypt initially into a quarry to the east of the Nile. After suffering hardships for a considerable time, they requested to be transferred from the quarry to the abandoned former Hyksos capital Avaris, where they chose as their leader Osarzeph, previously a priest of the sun god Re in Heliopolis, who renamed himself Moses. He gave the lepers a new religion that despised the Egyptian gods and their sacred animals, and enlisted the military support of the shepherds. This is a wrong interpretation of the term Hyksos in classical sources. So the Hyksos were Egypt's former foreign rulers, 1650 to 1550 BCE. So they enlisted the help of those shepherds in Jerusalem to revolt against Amenophis. With 200,000 of them joining their forces, they assumed control in Egypt, looted and profaned the Egyptian temples, slaughtered and ate the sacred animals. Amenophis fled to Ethiopia and could regain Egypt only 13 years later with the support of his son Ramses, leading to the expulsion of the shepherds and their polluted allies. This story is preserved in excerpts that the Jewish Roman historian Flavius Josephus cites from Egypt's first chronographer Manetho, mid-1st century BCE, and the Egyptian priest and Stoic philosopher Chaeremon, 1st century CE. Intriguingly, Manetho and Chaeremon give as Moses' original Egyptian names Osarzeph or Osarziph and Tiziten. And here is the text. Occupying the city and using the region as a base for revolt, they appointed as their leader one of the priests of Heliopolis called Osarzeph or Osarziph in one manuscript, and took an oath of obedience to him in everything. It is said that the priest who framed their constitution and their laws was a native of Heliopolis named Osarzeph, after the god Osiris, worshipped at Heliopolis. But when he joined this people, he changed his name and was called Moses. And then the other quote, "The next witness I shall cross-examine is Chaeremon. This writer likewise professes to write the history of Egypt and agrees with Manetho in giving the names of Amenophis and Ramesses to the king and his son. Isis appeared to Amenophis in his sleep and reproached him for the destruction of her temple in wartime. The sacred scribe Phritrobautes told him that if he purged Egypt of its contaminated population, he might cease to be alarmed. The king thereupon collected 250,000 afflicted persons and banished them from the country. Their leaders were scribes, Moses and another scribe, Joseph. Their Egyptian names were Tiziten for Moses and Pedazeph for Joseph, as that far goes the account. These names, which must have a historical or a narrative origin, have never been the topic of a thorough linguistic analysis. I propose here a new interpretation and will then attempt to contextualize them as possible political sobriquets used in domestic Egyptian discourse, maybe during the civil war at the transition from the 19th to the 20th dynasty. The first name here, Osasif, is in all probability a rendering of Egyptian Osir Khawf. Osiris is in his appearance. And I just give you here the different steps of my reconstruction in terms of the element Osiris, in terms of the vocalization that actually leads to the right vocalization in the classical sources. And I gave you examples, and there are more that attest to this change. And the S comes from a sound change in Egyptian, so the ch sounds, so velar fricatives, regularly became in certain environments an esh sound. It's in Coptic, and esh cannot be rendered in Greek by esh because Greek has no esh, so it's rendered as s. As we see, Cheops becomes Sufis. Palatalization, for those of who don't know what this is a shift of sound. Imagine the word nature. In German, Natur with the T sound, or in French, Nature. If you pronounce Natur pronounce a T, your tip of your tongue touches the alveolar dam above your upper teeth. And if you then move the tongue to the back towards your palate, you get nature in English. So the T changes to a ch sound. This is palatalization. So this is a frequent process in Egyptian. Personal names of the type divinity are in his or her appearance are well attested in the Middle Kingdom, probably feast names given to a child born during a procession of the god Osiris, or other gods. While such names are not currently documented after the Middle Kingdom, the appearance of Osiris is a motif well attested in the New Kingdom and later as a symbol of kingship and the god's triumph over Seth, the murderer of Osiris. For example, the great papyrus Harris that I will quote below starts with proclaiming that King Ramesses III appeared, that means assumed kingship, with the white crown like Osiris. A statement, Usir Khawf, Osiris is in his appearance, may thus in origin have served as a political slogan proclaiming Osiris' rightful kingship. In turn, its late pronunciation as Osasif or Osasif would have allowed for various derogatory polemics in the Greco-Roman period. For example, Seth, for people who no longer understood the original meaning of the name, may have recalled to readers the Egyptian root Sephi to be tainted, to be impure, maybe alleging that also Osiris was tainted like the people. As scholars have time and again suggested, the ancient audience may also have misunderstood Osasif as a pejorative variant of the name Joseph, assuming that the Hebrew divine name Yahweh, which in its shortened form is Yo, was substituted by the pagan god Osiris. And as you know, in reality, the element Yo in Joseph is a verbal prefix of a full name Yahweh, or God may add another child. But this might have been part of a pun that was used or insinuated in late times. The second Egyptian name, TZ10, given to Moses in this source, appears to be a precise rendering of Egyptian Chacha Tenu, the enemy from the cliff, or the enemy from the border, or the quarry. And again, I gave you here some elements of the vocalization. The original vocalization was something like Jijio in the New Kingdom. This sound J rendered, for example, Semitic Tzadeh, and the Greeks had difficulties rendering Tzadeh. So you have, for example, in a similar name, personal name Chacha, we have Greek renderings like Te with TT, with SS, with Tzitze, and similar. And precisely the same alternation between two different sounds is preserved in a toponym per Jaja. So here you have Jaja. In Arabic, it is Abu Tisht. And so this is precisely the sequence that you have in TC10. And then Chenu, the second element, is an Egyptian term for the cliffs on either side of the Nile Valley, often used in geomythological contexts to demarcate the borders of Egypt. However, it is also used in collocation with terms for quarry. Gallery quarries, such as those of Tura, east of Cairo, are located in the eastern cliff. They were also used throughout history for secondary purposes, such as a shelter for individuals, storage areas for supplies, etc. And there may be other relevant associations of the term. For example, in Papyrus Lansing 12.1 of the 20th dynasty, the cliff is singled out as a place of residence of elite officials. Raya has built for himself a castle on the cliff. What to make of these two newly gained etymologies? Can they be used as historical evidence? While the equation of the leader of the leper story with Moses has mostly been seen as a later interpolation, and the leper story as an amalgamation of motifs from the Hyksos period to the Ramesside period, linking it more directly to a historical situation in Egypt's history is a distinct option. I will make an attempt now to link the two names to a precise such history, the civil war at the transition from the 19th to the 20th dynasties. This time has been proposed, for example, by Manfred Bietig earlier today, by several scholars as a potential backdrop to the Exodus story. The following remarks will try to add the evidence provided by Moses' Egyptian names to this scenario. Around 1200 BCE, Egypt found itself engulfed in one of the most critical situations of its political history, a civil war shattering the country for one generation between the end of the reign of Merenptah, frequently mentioned today, and the reign of Setnachte, also mentioned here. Please memorize this chart of dates. The events of that time, including succession conflicts and attempts of pretenders to secure kingship, have triggered much scholarly debate. Here is a brief overview of the main issues of the conflict, which are also reflected in a complex history of tomb modifications in the Valley of the Kings, the necropolis of the rulers of the Egyptian New Kingdom. And I just also want you to quickly memorize this slide here. I just have tried, this is a simplified genealogy of the time, and the different colors just indicate to you briefly that, how conflicted the situation was. The people marked here in red were kings considered legitimate by the 20th dynasty. Those in purple, kings considered illegitimate, but not by the 19th, but by the 20th dynasty. Then we have in orange, there were temporary contenders to the throne that didn't make it to kingship. And then we have people like Bai in brown here that were also contenders for the throne. And this is just a simplified, what is still preserved of a situation that most likely was much more complex. So, and I mentioned these kings, many of them have left tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And you see right on the right side, you have cartouches from the tomb of King Siptach that were multiple times reworked, recarved, repainted, sometimes 2 or 3 times. So it seems the king, when Siptach died, somebody else tried to usurp the tomb, take it over, and then later somebody decided that the king would be carved in the name of the original king, etc. After Merenptah's death in 2014, the reigns of the legitimate heir to the throne, Seti II, and a contender, Amenmesse, 1209 to 08 BCE, seem to have at least partially overlapped, maybe with the latter as an anti-king in Upper Egypt. Seti II's names, followed by the second's tomb in the Valley of the Kings, shows evidence of the erasure of Seti II's names, followed by their recarving. Amenmesse initiated himself a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, but what was not buried here? The tomb was later reused for the burial of queens in the 20th dynasty. Seti II prevailed over Amenmesse, maybe thanks to the support of Bai, a high court official with the responsibility of great overseer of the seal for the entire land, often rendered as chancellor in English. Bai is often considered the kingmaker for Seti II's successor Siptach, as his epithets, who has placed the king on his father's throne and who has lifted the arm of the ruler, seem to insinuate. Siptach's mummy shows that he was a crippled person, unable to fulfill the ritual requirements of a pharaoh, and we will come back to this point in a moment. Bai probably aspired for the throne. A tomb of royal proportions for him in the Valley of the Kings was begun but left unfinished and was later reused by royal princes in the 20th dynasty. The political drama of those years is visible in the fact that Bai's preeminent depictions in Seti II's Prague sanctuary at Karnak were effaced and replaced by those of Seti II's young son, Prince Seti Meremtach, who, however, never ascended the throne. You see how dramatic everything was. And then the most dramatic witness we recently, or 20 years ago, published in year 5, probably, of King Siptach, and Ostrakon of the French Institute tells us, or told the workers in the Valley of the Kings, about Bai's execution as an enemy of state. Pharaoh, may he live, be prosperous and healthy, has killed the great enemy Bai. That was reported to the workers in the Valley of the Kings. Siptach himself adopted a new throne name and a new epithet in his birth name between his regnal year 2 and 3, likely in response to the domestic challenges. Then Seti II's widow, Terosre, took up the position of regent alongside the king and may have shared political power with Bai until the latter's execution. After Siptach's early death in year 6, she assumed then full kingship for another year and a half until she in turn was replaced and disposed by Setnachte, the founder of the 20th dynasty. Siptach's tombs in the Valley of the Kings showed 3 stages of erasure and restoration of his cartouches. The king was not considered legitimate by the subsequent 20th dynasty. In Terosre's own tomb in the Valley of the Kings, the depictions of Siptach were changed to those of Seti II. After Terosre's demise, Setnachte adopted the tomb for his own burial. An illustrative monument demonstrating the contentious history of the times and the contentious history of scholarship at the same time is a statue in Munich. You see that a statue, the Prince Siptach, the name is preserved on his belt, is preserved. The statue of the person on whose lap he was seated has been chiseled away. So it was no longer considered legitimate at one point, and you see just that the scholars are totally not in agreement of who might have been the chiseled away person, right? So there are many options here, just illustrating this crisis. This domestic crisis at the end of the 19th dynasty is documented in some of the most singular written documents preserved from ancient Egypt, documents departing from the Egyptian tradition that would regularly avoid addressing negative events. The Great Papyrus Harris in the British Museum, an accountability report on the reign of Ramesses III, describes in its historical prologue the time preceding Ramses' father Setnachte's reign as follows, and this is my translation. I marked here the text where it is, which I will translate here. The country of Egypt was cast out. Everyone was his own yardstick. They had no leader, with many years having previously given way to a period of other years. Thus, the country of Egypt consisted of chieftains and mayors, each of them killing one another, whether noble or lowly. Thereafter another time occurred, consisting of empty years, when Irsu, a certain Syrian, was with them as a chieftain, having put the entire country under his control. One person would team up with his companion in plundering their belongings. One treated the gods in the way of the people, in that one no longer sacrificed offerings within the temples. Then, however, the gods turned around towards mercy, letting the country be righteous according to its correct design by installing their son who had come forth from their body as ruler of every land on the great throne, Uzachaure Setepenre Meriamun, the son of Re Setnachte. The likeness of Seth, when he is in fury, he straightened out the entire land which had been rebellious, killing the unruly ones who had existed in Tamari, that is Egypt, and cleansing the great throne of Egypt. The text appears to differentiate between 3 periods of the civil war with widespread violence, a period of political fragmentation during which the country was ruled by chieftains and mayors, a subsequent other time when the entire country was subjected to the rule of a Syrian chieftain, Irsu, and then the restoration of order by King Setnachte, the founder of the 20th dynasty. Egyptologists have often attempted to understand the name Irsu, and Manfred Bitak mentioned this translation today too, as the one who made himself, or the self-made man, and to identify the Syrian chieftain with Bai, the contender to the throne. However, while Bai's preeminent political position is unquestioned, he was prevented from assuming kingship, he was executed, and also cannot be shown to have been of Levantine origin. In turn, I proposed some time ago to understand Irsu as Egyptian for the one who made 6 years, which would be a political code name for Siptach. A possible mother of Siptach, maybe remember the chart, geological chart, Shoteraya, with a Semitic name, is mentioned on a relief in the Louvre. Tewosre subsumed Siptach's regnal years in her own reign, and her name, Taweseret, the powerful one, may indeed be alluded to or politically subverted in the similarly sounding phrase, those who harmed it, Egypt, Tehausu, in the other exceptional document about the civil war. A stele of King Setnachte discovered by the German Archaeological Institute on Elephantine Island in 1971. After describing his election as ruler out of millions by the gods of Egypt, this text proceeds as follows. Now His Majesty was like his father Seth, spreading out his two arms to liberate Egypt from those who had harmed it. Seth's power, its protection enclosed his, mainly the king's body. His enemies fell before him after the fear of him had seized their hearts. They fled like sparrows and small birds when a falcon is after them, after they had dropped the silver, gold, copper, and linen of Tamari, Egypt, which they had given to these Asiatics in order to acquire fighters to attack the borders of Egypt. A remarkable parallel to the leper story. Their plans have failed, and their schemes, here a Semitic loanword is actually used in the text, have come to naught. When all gods and all goddesses appeared in festival, their wonders were in presence of the perfect God, this is Setnachte, predicting for him victory and that the opponents and enemies would fall under him. When the gods arbitrated against him, the depressed mood was brightened. Year 2, second month of summer, day 10, there were no more enemies of His Majesty in any lands. Several scholars have pointed to this precise situation in Egypt's civil war. Opponents of Setnachte paid people from the Levant to enlist military support from abroad, followed by their expulsion or escape, as a possible historical backdrop of the biblical story, such as Malamat and Bitak and others. The new evidence adduced through the proposed interpretation of Moses' Egyptian names can perhaps be tied to this historical context. A political slogan or sobriquet, Uza Emchau F, Osiris is in his appearance, can be seen as being aimed at Setnachte in a twofold way. First, by countering the claim of his throne name, Uzer Hau Ra, who is strong of the appearance of Ra, which means the one with very strong appearance, through the statement that instead of the king, Osiris is in his appearance. Second, Osiris' appearance as the rightful king would mean the god's triumph over his murderer Seth. The very god Setnachte evokes in his prenomen, Seth is victorious. It is interesting to notice that his Elephantine stele concludes by asserting that all gods and all goddesses appeared in festival. Is this an offer of political reconciliation, not prioritizing any deity's appearance? In turn, the label enemy from the cliff would be a derogatory political term used by Setnachte's faction for one of their main opponents, maybe an individual leading a revolt from Egypt's border region. A similar code word was in use for Akhenaten, who was labeled the criminal from Amarna in references after his demise. And I just mention that political sobriquets of this type are well attested in the political discourse of the late 19th dynasty. I mentioned the epithets by Bai, that are code names or political slogans that he used, beneficial for the gods. The king was called beneficial only for Re, so he wanted to amplify the name. I mentioned the other two epithets before, maybe with a disparaging innuendo, given the king's disability. Irsu also, who has made 6 years, possibly be a political code name or slogan. I come to the end. I will finish in time. The kings Amenophis and Ramses, referenced by the story of the lepers, can be understood as forming a historical bracket around the epoch of the civil war. Manetho, in his fragment 53, which is the epitome, the listing of kings, lists Amenophis as the successor of Ramses II. So Amenophis doesn't show up only in the 18th dynasty, but mistakenly he is listed by Manetho as the follower of Ramses II. The actual king would be Merenptah, so there's certainly a conflation here. And again, in fragment 55, this Merenptah appears as Amenephtis, clearly a conflation of the names Amenophis and Merenptah, as scholars have often noticed. Amenophis' son Sethos, also called Rameses after his grandfather Rapses, as mentioned by Manetho, would in turn represent the individuals ending the civil war, Setnachte and his son Ramses III. And the 13 years of purportedly foreign rule in Egypt can be regarded as comprising the combined reigns of Seti II and Amenmesse, 6 years, and of Siptach and Tewosre, 7 years. Tewosre could indeed have enlisted the support of Levantine people within Egypt, who then would have connected with people outside of Egypt that could have attacked Egyptian borders and support her political party within Egypt. So within Tewosr's conflict with Sednachte, we would then have to search for another individual labeled by the two sides of this conflict. Osiris is in his appearance, and Tizeten, the enemy from the cliff. While this interpretation is clearly speculative at this point, it may give support to a historical vindication of extra-biblical traditions about Moses. Whereas the biblical motifs of the Moses story do not allow us to pinpoint a precise historical context for the Exodus event, the tradition preserved by Manetho and Chairemon might provide precisely that nexus. If so, Sednachte's cleansing of Egypt of enemies from Canaan could indeed be regarded as evidence of the actual Exodus in Sednachte's second year, 1198 BCE. It remains to be seen whether other scholars will suggest alternative historical or narrative contexts for the names Osasef and Tizeten. But if they do, they will need to account for their correct linguistic interpretation. Thank you so much.
Any questions? We do actually have 2 minutes. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Is there any correlation between the Asiatic mercenaries that may have been hired and the APRU? APRU. I'm not, advocating. I'm just asking.
Use the microphone, please.
Okay. Difficult to say. We don't know who is intended here. So I personally prefer to see the APRU more as robbers, right? Gangs of robbers or so in the countryside, displaced people who had to make a living. Remember, David had to collect 400 people around himself, and then they looted the landscape, right? So the border between being a robber and being military also is quite fuzzy, right? So we don't know who those Levantines could have reached out to for military support. I would think those people would have been more skilled militarily if they had been intended to attack the borders of Egypt, right? Because Egypt had a well-trained army and was defeating the sea peoples and Libyans at the time. So just some APRU possibly wouldn't have made the cut, right? So I think some military troops, maybe from some of the city-states or so, of Canaan or so, but that escapes our knowledge at the moment.
Really quickly, who did Tizeten turn out to be?
Tizeten, who?
Tizeten in
Well,
Manetho.
if we like, you can see behind him Moses, right? Osasef and Tizeten as two code names of the same person. Maybe at one point we find an inscription actually mentioning that person. But as I always say, so much evidence has been lost from those times.
Yeah.
What we have is just coincidental.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.